There's a strange joke about being born after the Soviet Union collapsed. An entire superpower disappeared before some of us were even alive. And now, we're expected to casually understand why a country that no longer exists built some of the most recognizable machines on Earth. Because while the Soviet Union vanished, its cars didn't. They are still carrying families, crossing some of the harshest terrain on the planet, and even winning one of the toughest races in motorsport. Hello there, enthusiasts. Vance here. For decades, Russian cars have been dismissed as crude copies of Western designs. But that explanation is too simple. When engineers face the same problems, they often arrive at the same solutions. A country stretching across 11 time zones needed machines that could survive extreme weather, endless distances, and roads that sometimes seemed to be an optimistic suggestion. The forgotten circuits of Nakuru reveal the same truth. Cars are shaped by the worlds that create them, and behind the Iron Curtain, engineers were building for a very different world. Before there was the Soviet Union, before the Cold War, before the world knew Russia for rockets and tanks, there was a country trying to understand a new invention that was changing the world. The automobile had arrived. At the end of the 19th century, cars were still strange machines, loud, unreliable, expensive, and probably terrifying to anyone whose idea of transport was a horse that at least had the decency to make its intentions clear. But around the world, engineers were beginning to ask the same question. Will this machine replace the horse? In Imperial Russia, the automobile was initially a symbol of wealth and modernity. The wealthy imported machines from Europe, especially from Germany and France. Owning one was less about practicality and more about making a statement. Yes, I own a machine that occasionally breaks down, costs a fortune, and scares pedestrians. But look how advanced I am. But Russia had a problem that many European countries didn't face: scale. This was not a small industrial nation with cities separated by a few hours of travel. This was an enormous empire stretching across continents. The challenges that will define Russian vehicles were already there: distance, weather, infrastructure. A car built for a smooth European road had a very different future when introduced to a country where roads could disappear into mud for months at a time. The first attempts at creating a domestic automotive industry appeared in the early 20th century, but Russia was still far behind countries like Germany, France, Britain, and America. The automobile was evolving quickly, but Russia's industry was still trying to catch up. Then history changed. The Russian Revolution transformed the country completely. The old empire disappeared and the Soviet Union was born. And the new government inherited a massive challenge. How do you turn a largely agricultural country into an industrial power capable of competing with the world's leading nations? The answer was industrialization. Factories became symbols of progress, machines became symbols of power, and eventually, the automobile will become part of that vision. But building a car industry from almost nothing is not simple. The Soviet Union had the ambition. What it needed was the ability to produce cars on a scale that could transform an entire country. And for that, it will look across the ocean. A car industry does not begin with a car. It begins with factories, with steel, with engineering knowledge, with thousands of people learning how to turn raw materials into something that can move. And in the 1920s, the Soviet Union had a problem. It wanted to become an industrial superpower, but it had almost no experience producing automobiles at the scale it needed. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, America had already discovered the secret to putting the world on wheels: mass production. Henry Ford had transformed the automobile from a luxury item into something ordinary people could actually buy. The idea was simple: build many cars, build them quickly, make them affordable. A revolutionary concept at the time, making a machine expensive enough to impress people, but cheap enough that they could actually own one. The Soviet Union knew it needed this knowledge, so it turned to an unlikely partner: America. In the late 1920s, the Soviet government worked with Ford to establish automobile production in what will become the Gorky Automobile Plant, better known as GAZ. The goal wasn't to simply import American cars. The goal was to learn how to build an automotive industry. The first major product was the GAZ AA truck, based heavily on Ford designs. It became one of the most important vehicles in Soviet history. carried supplies, supported construction projects, helped develop infrastructure, and became the backbone of Soviet transportation. And this reveals something important about Soviet automotive philosophy. The car was not initially a symbol of personal freedom, it was a tool of national development. A truck could move materials, a tractor could transform agriculture, a factory could change the future. In this world, transportation wasn't just about getting somewhere, it was about building something. Then came the Second World War, and like almost every major industrial achievement of the era, the automobile was pulled into the machinery of conflict. Factories produced military vehicles, trucks moved troops and supplies, engineering priorities changed overnight. Reliability was no longer just convenient, it was survival. These experiences will leave a lasting mark on Soviet engineering. The lessons learned during industrialization and war created a philosophy that will define Russian vehicles for decades. A vehicle didn't need to be elegant, it needed to work. Now came a different question. Could it build cars that ordinary people actually wanted to own? Because creating a truck that survives a war is one thing, creating a car that represents everyday life is something else entirely. After the destruction of the Second World War, the Soviet Union faced the enormous task of rebuilding itself. Factories had to be restored, cities had to be rebuilt, and for the first time, the idea of personal transportation started becoming more than just an ambition. Because a nation can measure progress in many ways by the buildings it creates, by the machines it produces, or by whether ordinary people can finally own something that represents independence. One of the first symbols of this new era was the Gaz Pobeda. The name itself means victory, and that was not an accident. This was a car born in the aftermath of a devastating war, carrying a message that the country had survived and was moving forward. Compared to the cars that came before it, the Pobeda looked modern. It had a streamlined shape, integrated body design, and a style that reflected the changing world of the late 1940s. But there was still a uniquely Soviet reality behind it. Because designing a beautiful car is one thing, making enough of them for everyone is another problem entirely. For many Soviet citizens, owning a car was not as simple as walking into a dealership and choosing a car. There were waiting lists, limited availability, and a car could represent years of saving and patience. In some cases, getting a car was less like buying a product and more like being granted access to a very exclusive club. Then came the car that became one of the strongest symbols of Soviet life, the Volga. Unlike the basic transportation offered to ordinary citizens, the Volga occupied a different position. It was a car for professionals, officials, and people who had achieved a certain status. The Volga was not built to compete with a Mercedes Benz or a BMW in terms of luxury. It followed a different philosophy. It needed to be comfortable, reliable, and capable of handling conditions that could destroy less prepared vehicles. A German executive sedan might ask, how precisely can we engineer this? The Volga asked, will this still start when it's minus 30 degrees? But perhaps the biggest difference between the Soviet automotive world and the West was the relationship people had with their cars. In many Western countries, the automobile became a symbol of personal expression. Your car said something about who you are. In the Soviet Union, a car was often something more fundamental. It represented freedom. A car meant you could travel beyond your immediate surroundings, visit relatives, explore a country that seemed almost impossible to fully comprehend. For a nation measured in thousands of kilometers, mobility was a powerful idea. But if the Poveda and Volga represented progress and status, they still didn't solve the biggest problem. Most people still didn't have a car. The Soviet Union had built an automotive industry. It had built trucks, it had built government vehicles, but it had not yet built the car that will define everyday life. That car was about to arrive. If you grew up in Africa, there's a good chance you've never seen a ladder in your life. And that's strange, because this is one of the most produced cars in automotive history. It's the car that represented Soviet life. Millions were built, they carried families across one of the largest countries on earth. They were exported across continents. They even competed in motorsport. Yet in many parts of the world, the ladder feels like a car from a parallel universe. And maybe that's because in a way it was. The ladder was not created to chase the same dream as a BMW, a Ferrari, or even a Toyota. It wasn't about luxury, speed, or status. It was built around a much simpler question: how do you give millions of people a car that can survive their reality? The interesting part is that its story begins with a car from somewhere completely different: Italy. The ladder was based on the Fiat 124, a European Car of the Year win. But putting that car into Soviet conditions meant changing almost everything that mattered. The engineers weren't just copying a design, they were adapting a machine for a completely different environment. Because a car built for Italian roads had to survive frozen winters, rough terrain, and distances so vast that a long drive wasn't measured in hours, but sometimes in geography. A normal car is designed around a simple assumption that there will be a road. But what happens when the road is unreliable, the weather is hostile, and civilization is hundreds of kilometers away? You build something different. Because Russia is not just a country with cities connected by highways, it's a country of forests, mountains, frozen landscapes, and enormous distances. A vehicle here had to do more than transport people, it had to be a tool. Few vehicles represent this philosophy better than the UAZ 469. Created in the Soviet era, it was designed for one purpose above all: go where other vehicles couldn't. Military service was its original mission, but its toughness made it useful far beyond the battlefield. And luxury was not exactly the priority. The interior had all the warmth and sophistication of equipment designed by someone who believed comfort was a distraction from getting the job done. But that simplicity was intentional. Fewer complicated systems meant fewer things to fail. And when you are hundreds of kilometers from the nearest repair shop, simplicity becomes a survival feature. Then came a vehicle that quietly changed the idea of what an off-roader could be: the Lada Niva. Before the modern crossover became the default family vehicle, the Niva was already combining two worlds: the comfort and size of a small passenger car with the ability to survive terrain that would embarrass much larger machines. It wasn't built to look intimidating. It wasn't covered in luxury features. It didn't need to announce itself. The Niva had the confidence of someone who knows they don't need to dress well because they already know where they are going. Its secret was not brute force, it was weight. A compact body, four-wheel drive, simple mechanical systems, a design focused on getting through, not showing off. This reveals one of the biggest differences between Soviet and Western automotive thinking. Many Western vehicles were becoming increasingly focused on comfort, performance, and image. Soviet vehicles were often focused on one question: will it work? That doesn't mean they were perfect. They could be rough, they could be outdated, they could make owners very familiar with the phrase, "I know a guy who can fix that." But they had something valuable: character. And if a small vehicle needed to survive Russia's landscape, imagine what was required from the machines carrying entire industries. Because Russia's automotive story was never just about cars, it was also about giants. Trucks built to move impossible loads, machines built for war, construction, and exploration. And one of them would eventually become a legend in the world's toughest rally. A country that stretches across 11 time zones has a transportation problem. People need cars, cities need buses, industries need trucks capable of moving things that normal vehicles would simply refuse to carry. And when the Soviet Union built machines, it often built them with that one thought in mind: make it strong enough that failure becomes unlikely. Gas became one of the foundations of Soviet transportation. While brands like Lada became associated with families, gas became associated with work. Its trucks helped build cities, move supplies, and support an economy spread across one of the largest territories on earth. Simple, durable, easy to repair. Because when your truck is operating somewhere hundreds of kilometers from civilization, a complicated solution is usually just a future breakdown with extra steps. But Soviet automotive ambition wasn't only about practicality. There was another side: prestige. ZIL built some of the most luxurious vehicles in Soviet history. These were the cars of government officials and leaders: huge engines, hand-built interiors, an imposing presence designed to show that the Soviet Union could create machines of status as well as machines of utility. Of course, there was an interesting contradiction. The average citizen might wait years for a basic family car, while a small number of people traveled around in enormous and crafted limousines. It was a reminder that cars have always been more than transportation. They are symbols of freedom, of wealth, of power. But perhaps the most unexpected chapter belongs to Kamaz. At first glance, a heavy duty truck does not seem like something you'd associate with motorsport. Racing is usually about lightweight machines, precision, and speed. A truck is usually about carrying things, preferably without falling apart. But Dakar changes the rules. The Dakar Rally is one of the harshest motorsport events on earth. Thousands of kilometers, extreme heat, sand, rocks, terrain designed to expose every weakness a machine has. And Kamaz decided that a giant truck could not only survive it, it could win. The same engineering philosophy that created Soviet workhorses found a new battlefield. Not a factory, not a construction site, a desert. And this is where the story connects to motorsport. Because racing has always been a laboratory. Ferrari proved speed, Porsche proved efficiency, Kamaz proved endurance. It was a strange sight, a vehicle designed to move massive loads flying through the desert at racing speeds. Somewhere, an engineer probably looked at a normal truck and thought, this is good, but what if we made it jump? But then, the world that created these machines disappeared. The Soviet Union collapsed, and the automotive industry built around that system had to answer a difficult question. What happens when the world your cars were designed for no longer exists? In 1991, the Soviet Union disappeared, and with it went the system that created its automotive industry. For decades, Soviet cars had been designed around a very specific reality: a planned economy, limited competition, a focus on durability over choice. But suddenly, the rules changed. The world was now open, and Russian drivers were introduced to something that had previously been difficult to access: foreign cars, modern designs, better interiors, more advanced technology. And compared to many of these new arrivals, older Russian cars suddenly looked like they had traveled through time. A ladder parked next to a modern European sedan was like bringing a reliable old calculator to a smartphone convention. The calculator still works, but the audience has moved on. But one thing about Russian cars has always been difficult to kill: their practicality. Avtovaz, the company behind Lada, survived the transition. The designs evolved slowly, the philosophy remained familiar: affordable, simple, repairable. Because even in a changing world, there was still a market for vehicles that did not need to impress anyone. They just needed to work. To modernize, Russian manufacturers began looking outward. Foreign partnerships brought new technology, new platforms, and new approaches to production. The goal was no longer just survival, it was competition. But the global automotive industry was changing faster than ever. Electrification, software, Chinese manufacturers rising rapidly. The definition of what makes a successful car was changing again. Perhaps the clearest symbol of this ambition was Aurus, a modern luxury vehicle designed to show that Russia could still build a premium automobile. It represented a familiar idea, a nation proving that it could create machines of status. The same ambition, once seen in zeal, had returned in a new form. But the world had changed. Luxury was no longer just about size and presence. It was about technology, efficiency, and global appeal. Today, Russian manufacturers face a challenge unlike anything before. The automotive world is more competitive than ever. A company is no longer just competing with its neighbors, it's competing with the entire planet. The same question that shaped Russian cars for over a century remains: how do you build a machine for the world you live in? Because that has always been the story of the automobile. The best cars are not created in isolation. They are created by people responding to challenges around them. For more than a century, the automobile has been a reflection of human priorities. Every country that built cars left a piece of itself inside them. Germany built machines around precision. Italy turned cars into emotional expressions. America created symbols of freedom and power. Japan mastered efficiency and reliability. And Russia built something different. Machines shaped by distance, by climate, by necessity. That doesn't mean every Russian car was the best. They had weaknesses. They were often behind the cutting edge. They were rarely the most luxurious or exciting machines on the road. But judging them only by what they lacked misses the point. The UAZ wasn't created to impress someone outside a restaurant. The Niva wasn't designed to win a beauty contest. The Kamaz wasn't built because someone wanted a truck to look good parked outside a cafe. Although, to be fair, a Kamaz Dakar truck will probably make most things in a parking lot look slightly inadequate. They were built to solve problems, and that is what engineering has always been. The forgotten cars that race through Nakuru tell the same story. They were not just collections of metal, rubber, and mechanical parts. They were products of a time, a reflection of the people who designed them and the world they were trying to conquer. The Soviet Union is gone. The roads have changed. The automotive industry has transformed. But the machines it created remain. Because a car is never just a car, it's a piece of history you can drive. And sometimes the most interesting stories are not told by the fastest cars or the most expensive ones. Sometimes they are told by the machines built for a world completely different from our own.